There was a man who came to my consulting room in Zurich many winters ago. He was successful by every measure the world recognizes: wealth, reputation, a family that smiled in photographs. And yet he sat across from me with the eyes of a drowning man. He said, "Doctor, I have everything. Why do I feel nothing?" I did not answer him that evening. I let the silence speak first, because silence is the oldest analyst in the world. And in that silence I saw what he could not yet see, that his soul was not emptied because life had given him too little, but because he was carrying too much. He had collected things: opinions, masks, grievances, identities, expectations. He had accumulated a self that was not his own, and the weight of that false self was crushing the real one beneath it. This is what the modern world has forgotten. We speak today of rising, of ascending, of vibrating higher, as if the soul were a frequency we could tune by force of will alone. But I tell you, the soul does not rise because you push it upward. The soul rises because you finally stop dragging it down. Elevation is not addition, elevation is subtraction. And there are three burdens, three ancient, heavy, hidden burdens that every man and woman must lay down before the inner light can begin its slow and trembling ascent. I have watched this in my patients. I have watched it in myself. And tonight, by the quiet hour, I want to speak to you about these three. The first thing you must give up is the mask you have mistaken for your face. I call this mask the persona, borrowing the word from the ancient Greek theater, where actors wore carved faces of wood and clay to play their roles upon the stage. The persona is not in itself an enemy, it is necessary. A man without a persona is a man who cannot live among others, who cannot enter the marketplace, who cannot greet his neighbor or hold a position in society. The persona is the social skin we grow, so that the tender soul beneath may walk the world without being torn open by every glance. But here lies the great and terrible danger. The persona was meant to be a garment, and most of us have allowed it to become our flesh. Consider the man who has spent 30 years perfecting his role as the responsible son, the agreeable colleague, the patient husband, the smiling host. He has rehearsed his face so long that he no longer remembers what lies behind it. He smiles when he is in agony. He nods when he wishes to scream. He arrives at the celebrations of his own life feeling like a stranger at a wedding he did not attend. This is not authenticity. This is captivity. And the cruelest captivity is the one whose chains we have polished with our own hands. What mythology has been trying to tell us for centuries about this affliction is hidden in the old stories of the doppelganger, the double, the impostor who steals a man's face. In the German folk tales, a creature comes in the night and takes the form of a man so perfectly that the man himself begins to doubt which is the original. This is not superstition. This is psychology dressed in the costume of myth. The persona, when worshipped, becomes the doppelganger that replaces us. And one day we wake in the body of a stranger who answers to our name, who lives in our house, who is married to our spouse, and we cannot recall when the substitution occurred. Here begins the darkest game of the unconscious, for the persona does not announce itself. It does not say, "I am the false self." It says, "I am you. I am the only you. The other thing beneath me is shameful, dangerous, unacceptable. Stay with me and you will be loved." And so we stay. We stay through promotions and praise. We stay through the slow erosion of every spontaneous gesture. We stay until the day we look into the mirror and feel nothing. Not because there is no one in the mirror, but because the person in the mirror is no longer at home. To give up the persona does not mean to abandon all social form, to walk naked into the village square shouting your truth. That is not liberation. That is another mask, the mask of the rebel, which is often the cleverest disguise of all. No, to give up the persona means something quieter and more difficult. It means to know that you are wearing it. It means to feel, even in the middle of your most polished performance, the warm weight of the living soul beneath the costume. It means to come home, alone, at the end of the day, and remove the face gently, like a tired actor, and to sit for a few moments with the one who has been waiting for you in the dark. I have seen patients weep the first time they did this, not because the act was painful, but because they had not visited that inner person in 20 years, and that inner person was still waiting, still hoping, still loyal. The soul is the most patient lover in the universe. It will wait a lifetime for you to return. But it cannot rise, it cannot vibrate, to use the modern word, while you have buried it beneath a persona built to please a world that does not even remember your true name. And here I must say something that may unsettle you. The most surprising part of this first burden is yet to come. The persona is not only what you show to others. The persona is also what you show to yourself. There is a face we wear inwardly, a self-image we maintain in the privacy of our own minds, the image of the good person, the spiritual person, the strong person, the kind person. This inner persona is even more dangerous than the outer one, because there is no audience to break the illusion. We perform for ourselves in an empty theater, and we mistake the performance for reality. So when I tell you to give up the persona, I do not only mean the smile you wear at dinner parties. I mean the story you tell yourself in the silence of your own chamber. The story of who you are, who you have always been, who you cannot help but be. That story too is a mask. And until you can take it off, at least once, at least for a single trembling moment, the higher frequencies of the soul will remain close to you, like cathedrals locked from the inside. The second thing you must give up is the habit of seeing your own darkness in the faces of others. I have called this the shadow, and I have written more about the shadow than perhaps any other concept, because it is the great unfinished business of every human life. The shadow is everything in you that you have refused to accept as yourself. Your cruelty, your envy, your laziness, your hunger for power, your capacity for hatred, your secret pleasure in the misfortune of others, all that the moralizing voice of childhood taught you to disown, you placed in a sealed chamber within. And because it was too painful to feel inside, you began to see it outside. This is what I name projection, the great mechanism by which the unconscious returns what we have refused to swallow. The greedy man sees the world filled with greed. The deceitful woman believes everyone is lying to her. The one who fears his own rage rages against the rage of others. Whatever we cannot bear in ourselves, we discover with astonishing clarity in our neighbor, our spouse, our colleague, our enemy. And the more violently we condemn it in them, the more certainly it lives in us. For we do not see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. Modern man has lost his gods, but not his need for them. And so he has built a new pantheon out of his enemies. He worships at the altar of his outrage. He scrolls through endless feeds, searching for someone to hate, because hatred of another is the most efficient anesthetic against the knowledge of oneself. To despise a stranger requires no self-examination. To dislike a politician costs nothing, but to recognize that the cruelty you condemn in him is sleeping in your own chest. This is the work that the soul demands and the ego refuses. The detail most people overlook hides precisely here. We imagine that to vibrate higher, we must surround ourselves only with light, only with positivity, only with so-called high vibration people. But this is the great spiritual deception of our age. The shadow does not disappear because you ignore it. The shadow does not dissolve because you affirm it away with cheerful slogans. The shadow grows fat in the basement of the unrecognized self. And the more you decorate the upper floors of your house with mantras and incense, the more powerful and hungry the figure in the basement becomes. One day it will climb the stairs. It always does. The mythologies of the world have told this truth in 100 languages. The Egyptians spoke of Set, the dark brother who could not be banished but only confronted. The Greeks spoke of the Furies, the ancient sisters of vengeance, who pursued the man who had not faced his own crime. In the alchemical tradition, the great work began not in light but in nigredo, the blackening, the descent into putrefaction, the encounter with everything rotten and unwanted within the prima materia of the self. The alchemists were not seeking gold, they were seeking the transformation of the soul. And they knew, as we have forgotten, that no transformation is possible without first sitting in the darkness of what one has refused to be. Until you make the unconscious conscious, It will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is the law I have observed in every consulting room, every dream, every life I have studied. The shadow you do not own owns you. The trait you refuse to see in yourself you will marry, you will work for, you will vote for, you will be betrayed by, over and over, until you understand that the betrayal is the messenger and not the message. Life arranges your circumstances with cruel precision until you finally turn inward and meet the figure you have been fleeing. To give up projection is not to suddenly love your enemies. It is something far more sober. It is to pause in the moment of your most righteous indignation and ask the question that splits the world in two. Asterisk, what in me is this person showing me? Say, asterisk, not what is wrong with them, not what they deserve, but what is the disowned fragment of my own psyche that I have hung upon them like a coat on a hook? When you ask this question with sincerity, the entire architecture of your suffering begins to tremble, because you will discover, in case after case, that the person who has wounded you most was the perfect mirror for the part of yourself you had most determinedly refused to see. I knew a woman once who had spent her entire marriage despising her husband for his coldness. She came to me convinced that her unhappiness was his creation, that if only he would soften, she could finally live. We worked for many months, and slowly, painfully, she began to recognize that the coldness she had married was the coldness she had inherited from her own mother and had spent 40 years refusing to feel in herself. Her husband had not made her cold. Her husband had only stood beside her like a mirror in the marriage bed, reflecting back the frozen inheritance she had carried from her childhood. When she finally saw this, not as an idea but as a felt truth in her chest, she wept for 3 days. And then for the first time in her adult life, she felt warmth. This is the alchemy of the shadow, not its destruction, but its integration. You do not transmute lead into gold by pretending the lead does not exist. You hold it in the vessel of your awareness. You apply the slow fire of honest attention, and you allow it, over time, to reveal its hidden brightness. For the shadow is not only evil, the shadow contains everything you have rejected, and much of what you have rejected is your own beauty, your unlived life, your forbidden passion, your suppressed creativity, your tenderness, your wildness, your power. The man who has buried his cruelty has often buried his strength alongside it. The woman who has buried her anger has often buried her sovereignty. To give up projection, then, is to come home to a much larger self than the one you had agreed to be. It is to reclaim the exiled parts. And here begins the real ascent, not into some distant high frequency, but into the wholeness that was waiting patiently beneath your judgments of everyone else. The third thing you must give up is the illusion that you are the one in command. This is perhaps the most difficult, because the ego does not wish to release its throne. The ego is the little king who sits at the center of consciousness and believes itself to be the whole kingdom. It says, asterisk, I decide, I choose, I am the author of my life, I direct the play. Asterisk, and within a certain narrow domain, this is partly true. The ego is a necessary organ of the psyche. Without it, we would dissolve into the dreaming sea of the unconscious and never come back. But the ego becomes a tyrant when it forgets that it is only one province in a much vaster country. What lies beyond the ego I have called the self, and I capitalize the word deliberately because the self is not the personal I that wakes each morning and looks for its coffee. The self is the totality, the wholeness, the deeper organizing center of the psyche that contains the conscious mind, the personal unconscious, and the great inheritance of the collective unconscious beneath them both. The self is the inner sun around which the ego is only a small planet. And the painful, beautiful truth is that real transformation requires the planet to remember that it is not the sun. What Jung said about this is deeply unsettling, and I will say it now in my own words. The ego must die for the self to be born. Not literally, of course. The ego is not annihilated. It is dethroned. It is moved from the center of the kingdom to its proper place as a servant of something greater. And this dethronement is rarely welcomed. It is usually experienced as a crisis, a depression, a breakdown, a loss, a betrayal, an illness, a dark night in which everything the ego had constructed begins to fall apart. The midlife crisis, which the modern world treats as a comic embarrassment, is in fact one of the most sacred passages of the human soul. It is the moment when the ego's project has been completed, has been found insufficient, and the larger self begins to press upward through the cracks. I have watched men and women resist this passage with all the desperation of a drowning swimmer refusing the rope. They double down on the career. They acquire the younger lover. They buy the louder car. They take the longer cruise. Anything to avoid the descent, anything to keep the little ego on its little throne. But the self will not be denied. It will arrange whatever circumstances are necessary. The divorce, the diagnosis, the loss, the failure, to bring the ego to its knees. Not because the self is cruel, but because the self is patient, and it knows what the ego does not. That the throne the ego clings to is made of cardboard, and that beyond the cardboard lies a real kingdom of gold. The real turning point begins right here, when you stop trying to manage your life like a corporation and begin to listen to it like a piece of music, when you allow the dream you had last night to speak to you instead of dismissing it, when you notice the symptoms of the body as messages and not as malfunctions, when you read the synchronicities of your days as a language of a deeper intelligence reaching toward you. The ego cannot do this. The ego can only plan, control, defend, and acquire. To listen, to receive, to surrender to the slow unfolding of an intelligence greater than oneself. This is the office of the self, and the ego must learn to bow to it. The mystics of every tradition have spoken of this surrender, though they have used different names. The Christian called it the death of the old man and the birth of the new. The Sufi called it fana, the annihilation of the personal will in the will of the beloved. The Buddhists spoke of the dissolution of attachment to a fixed self. The alchemists drew the symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent that devours its own tail, signifying the great cycle in which the ego is consumed and reborn as something larger than itself. And the Hindus spoke of Atman and Brahman, the personal self, meeting the cosmic self, and the inner sound of Om that vibrates through all things, beneath all noise, where the ego at last grows still enough to hear. To give up the ego's claim to command does not mean to become passive, weak, or directionless. On the contrary, the man who is bowed to the self is more decisive, not less, more powerful, not weaker, more clear, not more confused, because his actions no longer arise from the anxious calculations of a small king defending a small throne. His actions arise from the deep currents of his own wholeness. He moves the way a river moves, not because the river is straining and pushing, but because the river has consented to gravity, to the slope of the land, to the call of the distant sea. The river that has stopped fighting its own course becomes unstoppable. Now you might ask me, how does one begin? How does one give up these three burdens? And here I must be careful, because I will not give you a method, a 5-step program, a morning routine, a formula. The soul cannot be hacked. The soul can only be befriended. But I can tell you what I have learned in 50 years of sitting with the suffering souls who came to my room. Begin with the dream. The dream is the first letter the unconscious writes to you each night, and most of you throw it away unopened. Keep a notebook by your bed, write down whatever fragments remain. Do not interpret them prematurely. Sit with them the way you would sit with a strange and beautiful guest who speaks a language you are only beginning to learn. Over weeks, over months, the dreams will begin to weave themselves into a pattern, and the pattern will reveal something of your own depths that no book could ever tell you. Begin with the question. Whenever you find yourself in the grip of a strong reaction, anger at someone, contempt for someone, obsession with someone, pause before you act on it. Ask, what is this person showing me about myself? Not as a self-flagellation, but as a curiosity. The world is constantly arranging mirrors before us. The only question is whether we will look into them or only at them. Begin with the silence. Find somewhere in your day 10 minutes when you are not consuming information, not performing, not producing, not optimizing. Just sit. Let the inner figures come. Let the discomfort rise. Let the boredom thicken into something deeper. In that silence, beneath the chatter of the ego, the older voice of the self will eventually begin to whisper. It does not shout. It does not compete. It waits for the room to grow quiet, and then it speaks, not in words at first, but in feelings, in images, in sudden clarities that arrive like guests in the night. And remember always that this work is not linear. You will not give up the persona once and be done with it. You will recognize it and forget it and recognize it again 1,000 times. You will integrate one fragment of the shadow and discover another waiting behind it. You will dethrone the ego on Monday and find it back on its throne by Thursday. This is not failure. This is the rhythm of the work. The soul does not ascend in a straight line. It ascends in a spiral, returning to the same themes at deeper and deeper levels. The ancients drew this spiral on their cave walls long before they had a word for psychology. They knew that the inner journey is not a march, but a dance. In the darkest corner of your soul waits the light you fear the most. This is the great paradox I have encountered again and again. We imagine that what we have buried within is monstrous, unforgivable, unworthy of light, and so we keep it sealed. But when we finally descend, when we finally open the chamber, what we find is not the monster we feared. What we find is the child we abandoned, the wild creature we domesticated, the artist we silenced, the lover we forbade, the king or queen we denied, the light we could not believe was ours. To vibrate higher, then, if I must use the language of the present age, is not to climb into some thin atmosphere above the human. It is to descend fully into the human that you are and to integrate everything you find there. The high vibration is not a place in the sky. The high vibration is a wholeness on the earth. It is the chord that sounds when all the notes of the self are at last permitted to be played, the bright and the dark, the loved and the unloved, the conscious and the unconscious, the ego and the self in their true relation. The man who came to my consulting room that winter evening, the one who had everything and felt nothing, he eventually did the work. He laid down his persona slowly over many years. He met his shadow in his dreams and in his marriage and in his rages, and he learned to call those figures by their right names. He came to understand that he was not the author of his life, but its student. And the last time I saw him, before I retired from active practice, he was older but lighter. Not happier in the cheap sense, but deeper. There was room in him now, room for joy and room for sorrow. Room for the man he had been and room for the man he was becoming. He had given up the 3 burdens, and what had risen in their place was not a higher frequency, but a fuller silence, the silence of a soul that had finally come home. So I leave you tonight with a question, the way I have always preferred to leave my patients, not with an answer, because the answers belong to you, and only the questions are mine to give. When was the last time you took off your mask, looked into the face of your shadow, and bowed before the deeper self that has been waiting all this time beneath the noise of your becoming? Sit with that question. Do not rush to answer it. The soul will reply in its own season, often in a dream, often in a tear that surprises you, often in a sudden stillness in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. And when it replies, listen, for that reply is the first true note of the higher song you have been searching for, sung not by some distant frequency, but by the oldest and most patient voice within you, the voice that has been calling you home since the day you were born. Until next time, walk gently with yourself. The work is long, but you are not alone in it. The whole of the human family, living and dead, has walked this same dark and luminous path before you. Their footprints are everywhere in the snow. You have only to look down and to begin.